A record number of children dying in war and conflict. The UN names and shames those responsible in places like Yemen and the Palestinian territory. But do the powers behind the bombs and the bullets actually care? And what needs to be done to protect the lives of children? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, more kids are dying in wars and conflicts than ever before. That's according to the United Nations, which is about to release its annual report on children and armed conflict. Al Jazeera has seen an advance copy. A special UN representative found more than 24,000 cases of children being killed, maimed or forced to become child soldiers last year. The report highlights rising casualties in war zones such as Yemen, where the Saudi-UAE coalition is fighting Houthi rebels. And despite condemning Israel for the deaths of Palestinian children, Israel is not on the report's blacklist of offenders. Right, let's have a look at some of those figures now. The report says the Saudi-UAE coalition in Yemen is responsible for almost half of all child casualties in the country last year. 729 killed or injured out of a total of almost 1,700. The Houthi rebels were blamed for 398 casualties, and the Yemeni government forces were blamed for 58. The UN says Israeli forces caused the deaths of 56 Palestinian children and the wounding of almost 2,700. Now, that's the highest number in 4 years. And there's Syria. Airstrikes, barrel bombs and cluster munitions killed or injured more than 1,800 children. And Afghanistan topped the list for another year with more than 3,000 child casualties. All right, let's introduce our panel now. In Toronto by Skype, we have Noha Abou-eldahab, who's a fellow at the Brookings Doha Center, specialising in conflict and transitional justice. In Beirut, we have Rami, senior fellow at the Issam Institute for Public Policy at the American University of Beirut. In Lancaster, in the UK, also on Skype, Simon Mabon, senior lecturer in international studies at Lancaster University. Welcome to you all. Noha, I've just read out a litany of bad news affecting children around the world, particularly in conflict areas. Why do you think we are seeing a larger number than ever before of children being killed or maimed in conflicts?
Well, the short answer really is that there's a lack of accountability for these violations, and actually the bad news that you just mentioned is in reality much worse than what is captured in such UN reports. I mean, with regards to Yemen, for example, the number of child casualties mentioned in these reports is only really a glimpse into the extent of the atrocities that children suffer. These casualties have to do with armed conflict in a very sort of narrow sense, in the sense of ground fighting, airstrikes, unexploded ordnances, and so on. But really, there are tens of thousands of children who are dying of starvation and of disease as a direct result of the armed conflict. And so, unfortunately, these reports only really capture a very small part of what is actually going on here.
That's even more gloomy, isn't it? And Rami, do you agree with Noha then that it is really as a consequence of a failure of an international system of accountability?
Yes, I agree fully with her, and I would even go further, because you have situations like in Palestine and Israel, for instance, where the conflict creates damage to schools, children become displaced, jobs are lost because of the siege on Gaza, normal economic activity can't go on. So the entire economic foundation of a society, the Palestinian society, starts to crumble, and families don't have enough food, malnutrition increases, stunting increases, So there's a whole ripple effect of damage that's done to the physical and mental well-being of entire families, not just children. And these reports really capture just the surface manifestation of the worst battle casualties, but the depth of destruction is much worse. And parallel to that is what she said at the beginning, that there's no accountability. The whole process of international law has collapsed in virtually most of the Middle East, because you even have, respectable governments like the UAE and the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Egyptians and others who are doing terrible things to their people in jails, to killing people after kangaroo trials. You have countries like Iraq and Syria and parts of Lebanon and other places where terrible things are happening to people, and there's just no real international accountability whatsoever, because the all-out warfare that has spread across the region, essentially since the Syrian war started 8 years ago, has really engulfed many, many parts of the area, and therefore law really finds no place to rear its head.
Right, and Simon, coming to you, I'm also looking at figures now, this coming from a Save the Children report from earlier this year, which says that 5 times more children than combatants are actually killed in conflict. I mean, is the nature of conflict, the way wars are being fought, is it changing? And is that perhaps responsible for the increasing number of children getting caught up?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the reasons. We know that conflict is getting more complex. We know that battlegrounds are changing. Traditionally, they would be separate from urban areas. And in recent years, particularly post 9/11 in the Middle East, we've seen that they've become really, really embedded within urban areas. So as conflict increases, as conflict becomes more and more intractable, it's going to have more and more of an impact on the lives of people living within those cities. So I don't think it's particularly surprising that conflict has become more complex. It's become more embedded structurally within the political fabric of a state. And as a consequence, it's having an absolutely devastating effect on the people that are most vulnerable living within those particular areas: children, the elderly, the infirm, people who are unable to flee these conflict zones. And I think what Rami has just articulated about the mental dimensions are incredibly important. This report is hugely devastating in terms of the death and the casualties of children. But there is, of course, a much deeper mental dimension in terms of the amount of trauma that children have gone through, the PTSD that they will have experienced through living in their formative years through a conflict zone, which will have an absolutely devastating impact on their lives, on the lives of those around them.
So very, very grim today, but also incredibly grim for the future, it would appear. Noha, coming back to you, when we're talking about the changing nature of conflict, we are not necessarily talking about state versus state, are we? We're often talking about non-state actors battling each other, civil wars, localised, intranational conflict. Is this perhaps a contributing factor to this terrible scenario that we're looking at today? And that is not just of children, of course, but civilians being killed and injured increasingly.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. The expanding sort of nature of non-state actors and their role in armed conflict certainly complicates and worsens the crimes committed in these conflicts. But it also complicates this issue of holding non-state actors accountable. And I should add that there's another very sort of important missing part of these reports. When you look at them, you'll see countries such as Sudan and, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, Syria, etc., listed, and the parties to those conflicts named and shamed for their role in the armed conflict. But big missing part here is the role of Western powers in particular, whether it's the US or the UK, and their complicity and their support really in the perpetration of these crimes. And since we're on the subject of non-state actors, there's also this issue, of course, of these multinational corporations and their role in their complicity in these crimes. And so this is another sort of Achilles heel of these reports, is that they don't really capture the role of these powers. I mean, how powerful would it be if the UK and the US and other such powers were named and shamed for their role in perpetrating these atrocities, whether it's in Syria or Yemen or other countries?
Well, there are efforts to do that, aren't there? There are efforts in the UK against the British government and indeed against in Congress against the US government. Rami, coming to you. I'm just wondering, Noha mentioned the concept of naming and shaming. How shamed would a country be, like, for instance, the Saudi-UAE coalition in Yemen, which is named in this report to be released by the UN next week? And how shamed would that coalition be to be on that, to be publicly identified as being responsible for so much horror? I mean, do you think it really matters to them?
Well, recent years suggest that it doesn't matter at all, because what they would do is they would go to the White House, announce a big new arms deal with the United States, go to London, announce a big new PR campaign with big pictures on buses, maybe go buy a football team in Paris, and then they would be the best friends of the two major Western powers, and nothing else really matters to them. This is one of the problems, and Huda mentioned this, the presence of the international players, really the terrible thing that's happened, and this comes right out of the Syrian war. The Syrian war, which is still going on, has been really a terrible historical turning point, because what's happened in the last 8 years in Syria is we've ended up with coalitions of a major international power, a local government or two, and non-state actors all working together in a fighting force on the ground. So in Russia, you had Russia, the Syrian government, Hezbollah, and various groups on the ground facing rebel groups, the United States, Gulf supporters, and sometimes Turkey. So these coalitions on both sides fighting each other. You have the same thing in Yemen, and you have this now happening in Libya. You're starting to see it, and there's not only direct involvement in Western and Russian and Turkish and other Iranian, other foreign governments, not just supplying arms, but they're actively fighting on the ground with their troops, with their artillery units, with their special forces, and with their air forces. It's quite an extraordinary situation of all-out warfare, all combining states, non-state actors, and foreign powers, and there's nobody who can do anything about this. So that's a long answer to your question, which is that governments are not particularly shamed by being named. The only thing that really matters to them is if there's some serious legal action that's taken to actually deter them, and there's no sign of that, unfortunately.
Right. Simon, it's often said, isn't it, that the world is pretty much dictated by interests. How much political pressure would you say is brought to bear upon the UN itself, for instance? I mean, this particular section of the UN is the Children and Armed Conflict section of the UN. They report to the Secretary-General, but the report is criticised insofar as it doesn't name and shame sufficiently. It doesn't attribute blame as harshly or as clearly as it might. In particular, I'm thinking of the Israeli Defence Forces. They are highlighted as having been responsible for a larger number of Palestinian child deaths last year than have been in the last 4 years, and yet they don't appear in the annex, the list of baddies, they don't appear there at all. So how much pressure is the UN under when it's compiling a report like this to actually keep a certain balance, if you like, in terms of other political interests?
I think that's a really important point, and that it really gets at a fundamental problem with all UN bodies, all UN agencies, that they have to balance the sort of the impartiality and and the interests of the particular body with broader geopolitical interests. And so here you have a report that's trying to really get to the bottom of what's happening on the ground, but it feels compelled to sort of pull back from fully naming and shaming the Israeli Defense Forces, the United States, the United Kingdom for their complicity in events. And I think that gets to this fundamental power imbalance in the structural organization of the United Nations, which means that the powerful states wield a great deal of disproportionate influence across the United Nations, particularly in the Security Council. And we see this, of course, in the Human Rights Council as well, where there are particular human rights agendas that are suppressed by members of the council who are sitting on this council and don't want these to be articulated. So it is power that triumphs over broader normative concerns such as human rights and such as children's interests and children's survival.
All right, so Simon raises an important point, I think, Noha, and power in terms of the Security Council, I suppose, resides with the permanent five, and there is pretty much paralysis, isn't there, on the Security Council? But, I mean, the Saudis, again, I mean, they are allegedly responsible for dangling substantial amounts of money before the very eyes of the Secretary-General of the UN in order to ease their way, if you like, through some potentially uncomfortable moments, both on the UN Human Rights Council and also within the UN's Security Council deliberations, particularly on the war in Yemen. So money matters.
Yeah, of course. Unfortunately, money does matter. And it's not just Saudi Arabia that has put the Secretary General under pressure. It's several other countries, including the UK, especially in the Human Rights Council. And so it's unfortunate that it seems over the last couple of years in particular that the Secretary General is kind of caving into this pressure a little bit. You see it in the language. It's not as strong as it should be in these reports. And again, we've spoken already about the lack of accountability, the lack of enforcement, any kind of enforcement measures following these reports. But of course, I mean, in theory, the UN should not be caving into this pressure and should stand firm.
Right. And Rami, so are we saying that this the supremacy of these interests, if you like, of the various powerful players internationally are collectively undermining what is supposed to be a rules-based international system? There are laws that are supposed to protect children and civilians, particularly in war, but they seem to be ignored at the moment.
Yes, that's true. And I've been interacting a lot with various UN agencies and international NGOs working all over the Middle East in the last year or two, dealing with women and children and marginalized people. And they're just scrambling around trying to figure out how do they minimize the deaths of young people rather than what they were doing 5, 10, and 20 years ago, which is to expand the well-being of young people and the survival rate and the health and the immunization rate and all that. And there's such an overwhelming need for services to deal with simply keeping people alive, especially 60 million people, 60 million people in the Arab world who need humanitarian aid simply to stay alive and in decent shape biologically. And this figure is gonna keep increasing. So the situation really is one in which there is no sign of any action that is going to change the situation. What we really need, though, and this is where there is still an opening, and people do try it, we've seen it in Yemen, we've seen it in other places, you need vigorous political initiatives to try to end the conflicts. If you end the war, you end all this suffering. Many of the parties who are fighting each other, many of them have legitimate grievances, not all of them, but many of them do. And if you address those legitimate grievances, zero in on the people on the ground, get the foreign fighters and criminals and donors out, and zero in on the conflict on the ground and find a resolution that satisfies everybody, you can end some of these conflicts, and therefore you end this cycle of increasing suffering and vulnerability. The problem with some of these situations, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, is this has been going on for 100 years. We've had 100 years of Israeli colonization of Arab land, and it's still going on, and there seems to be nobody in the world who is willing or able to do anything about it. So some of these conflicts need much more effort than a purely localized one.
Right. Simon, which brings us, I suppose, to history and tradition, and that is leadership has traditionally been provided by the United States, hasn't it, since in the post-war Second World War era. That seems to be lacking, shall we say, at the moment. Do you think that perhaps it's too simplistic to link the current situation we're in now, where we seem to be going backward in terms of moral principles and rule of law? Can we link the two to the fact that America has turned inwards?
Perhaps, but I think there's probably more to it than that. And if we look at the conflict and the impact of conflict on children and marginalized people across the past few decades, we'll see that this has been continuing. This is even increased whilst America has been more involved in the global stage and in actually articulating more liberal projects under the likes of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. This had a massive there was a massive increase in the number of people affected by conflict. And I think that obviously under Trump, it's had a marked impact on America's role in the world, and it's sort of stepped back from its leadership position. But it's not just about that. There's a complexity of conflict that has evolved over the past few decades. And the report talks about building sustainable peace. But as Rami is suggesting, that it's difficult to build that sustainable peace when there is conflict going on. But the sustainable peace is essential to actually preventing future conflict in future generations, addressing long-standing grievances, addressing long-standing needs for food, for shelter, for water, for basic human needs. So it's not just about addressing the conflict and making people safe from war, but we have to do more. The UN has to do more in order to actually build this sustainable peace. And it will require leadership from a range of different groups, not just the United States, who's routinely flaunted these rules and these norms. It will require strong leadership from a range of different sectors that will hold each other to account. But of course, this is incredibly idealistic, and I doubt that we'll see it anytime soon.
Oh, I see. OK. And so, Noha, it seems very much as though all roads lead back to the UN. We look to the UN to do so much, particularly in a world that's devoid of obvious national leadership. The UN have started a process, haven't they, in Yemen? Obviously, this is described as perhaps the worst humanitarian crisis in the world at the moment. What do you think of the Stockholm Agreement as a beginning, as a start to perhaps stopping that dreadful war in Yemen?
I mean, any agreement that's geared towards stopping, lifting a blockade or stopping the fighting is, of course, very welcome. I think there have been a lot of issues with the Stockholm Agreement. One of them being that it's very, very much focused on Hodeidah and has led to sort of this dismissal, really, of a focus on the rest of the country, which is just as important. But I think just to follow on the discussion earlier, another sort of factor that is really important and an opening, as Rami called it, is the role of civil society in these countries, right? The solution doesn't begin and end with the United Nations. The role of civil society, if you look at the role of civil society in Syria, for example, but of course in all of these conflict countries, is absolutely crucial. But unfortunately, it seems that more often than not, international organizations or international policymakers don't have this as meaningful an engagement with these civil society actors as they should. And so the result is that there's sort of a delayed resolution to these conflicts. Working with these local actors is absolutely crucial to try and bring an end to these armed conflicts.
Right. Rami, I'll give the last word to you, and if you can make it brief, please. So Noha offers us a glimmer of hope, and I'd like to end on that, if possible. She sees that there is potential, perhaps, in stimulating the civil society's role and participation in these processes, and that could help us out a lot.
She's absolutely right. And it's not just civil society as such, it's just all local people working together in their normal day-to-day life. One of the things that I've been amazed at, and not so surprising in my 50 years of covering the Middle East as a journalist, has been that in all of these conflict situations, when you see local communities Arabs and Israelis, Arabs and Turks, Iranians and Saudis, Sunnis and Shias, Christians and Muslims, whoever it may be, any two people who seem to be having a fight, when you go to the local level, they're living together, they're going to school, they're playing football, they're creating businesses. They know how to coexist peacefully. And this is really one of the great unexplored areas of peacemaking, stability, and national development that has to be looked at through civil society, through political mediation, and through other forms. We know how to live peacefully and coexist in this region if the big powers and some of the external actors and local criminal leaderships in the various countries stay out of this process. And so this is really an area that we have to explore much more carefully. And it does actually, even in Syria during the war, you had local communities that made ceasefires and got along reasonably well. So that's definitely an area for a lot of work.
Thank you very much indeed. A note of relative optimism. Thank you all very much indeed. Rami Khouri in Beirut, Simon Mabon in Lancaster, and Noha Abou-eldahab in Toronto. Thank you all very much indeed. And thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. Should you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. From me and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.